Hi, I'm Clara, and this is the story of how being my mother's favorite, until my sister got sick, taught me more about worth, trust, and the price of being needed only when it's convenient. For a long time, I believed her affection was real, until the day she looked through me like I was nothing more than a past investment. But what truly stung wasn't being replaced. It was realizing I had never really been chosen for who I was, only for what I could give. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like someone's love came with a price tag? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This story might just reflect more than one family's truth. The last piece of pumpkin pie sat on my plate, untouched, its warmth slowly fading into the silence of the room. From 2 blocks away, I could still catch the faint sound of laughter, coming from Ivy's house. The glow of lights behind her curtains looked soft and inviting, but I wasn't invited. I'd been told Thanksgiving dinner wasn't happening this year. Something about travel issues and people not feeling well. Clearly, the only one left out was me. Earlier that week, Mom had called to say Ivy wasn't feeling great and that it might be safer if everyone celebrated in their own homes. She said she'd drop off a plate. What she delivered instead was nothing. No food, no message, just quiet. I sat alone in my small kitchen in Eugene, Oregon. The window was open just enough to let in the scent of wet leaves and smoke drifting from a nearby chimney. The silence in my apartment was heavy. No clatter of dishes, no seconds being offered, no loud debates over football. Just me, the cold pie, and the realization I'd been avoiding. I wasn't one of them anymore. I tried to recall the last time I felt like I belonged. Maybe it was before Ivy's illness, before the shift. Back then, Mom would call me every morning. We'd laugh about crossword puzzles and swap recipes. She'd ask for help navigating her online banking. But after Ivy got sick, those calls stopped. I was no longer a daughter. I was just a name on a form. A knock on the door startled me. I wiped my eyes and opened it to find a delivery bag on the mat with a note tucked beneath the handle. Thought you could use some real dinner. Eugene? Eugene, the neighbor upstairs with the mismatched socks and warm cinnamon scent. We'd shared elevator rides and weather talk. Months ago, I carried his groceries after he hurt his back. I hadn't expected anything in return. But here it was. I carried the bag inside, and the scent of roast chicken and mashed potatoes nearly undid me. I sat, took a bite, and felt something shift. I wasn't completely alone. Looking out toward Ivy's glowing house, I saw shadows moving behind curtains. Celebration without me. They'd made their choice. And now, I would make mine. I opened the drawer and pulled out a manila folder, the one with copies of Ivy's medical power of attorney, signed years ago when Mom had called me crying. I'd given them everything, trusted them, but trust, like pie, goes cold if you leave it too long. The folder was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in what it carried. I hadn't opened it since the day I signed the forms. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table in Mom's house, the paper trembling in my hands as Ivy lay upstairs recovering from her second round of chemo. Mom had asked, gently but insistently, that I become Ivy's medical proxy. Just in case, she'd said. You're the responsible one. We trust you. And I had signed. Of course I had. Now, staring at those same documents under the harsh kitchen light of my own apartment, the words felt like a pact I had made with people who no longer remembered me unless they needed something. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom, for the first time in weeks. Mom, hope you're doing okay. We missed you today. Missed me? I hadn't even been invited. My thumb hovered over the reply. I could have said something sharp, could have sent a photo of the folder, reminded her of the trust she'd asked for, and what she'd done with it. But I didn't. I locked my screen and set the phone face down. Outside, Eugene's hallway light flickered as someone passed. I took the folder and climbed the stairs 2 flights up. His door was slightly ajar, warm light spilling out into the corridor. I hesitated, then knocked. "Clara?" His voice was surprised, but kind. "Everything all right?" I held out the folder. "Not really," I said, "but I think I need to understand what I agreed to." He opened the door wider and gestured for me to come in. His place was cozy. Plants in chipped mugs on the windowsill, a radio playing soft jazz, and the same cinnamon scent lingering. He didn't pry, just poured tea and sat beside me as I flipped through the pages, reading each clause aloud, then quietly staring at the implications. "I gave them more than permission to make decisions," I said. "They used this to access bank accounts, insurance." He nodded slowly. "That's not uncommon, but it depends on how the POA is written." I looked at him, surprised. "You know about this stuff?" "Retired social worker," he said with a shrug. "I've seen families do wonderful things with trust, and I've seen them use it as leverage." I stared at the page in my lap. I think I was leverage. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. When I left his apartment, it was nearly midnight. I carried the folder back like a piece of myself I had finally retrieved. At my door, I paused and looked down the hallway. Eugene's lights were still on. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while, I felt less like a bystander and more like someone waking up inside her own life. And I had just begun to wonder, if trust could be used to harm, could it also be used to heal? From a child who was always loved by his mother every day, I was suddenly left out without any reason. Until I checked some papers and realized true love. If you sympathize with me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. I barely slept that night. My mind kept looping through the folder, the forms I'd signed, and the particular tone Mom always used when she needed something. There was a rhythm to it, gentle, urgent, seasoned with just enough guilt to blur the line between love and manipulation. By morning, I found myself walking to the cafe on 5th and Maple, the one with chipped mugs and loyal regulars. Inside, 2 old men were arguing over a crossword puzzle. A mother bounced her baby while sipping coffee, and the barista, who never spelled my name right, handed me a cup labeled Clara. I didn't correct it. Sliding into my usual corner booth, I opened the folder again. My eyes scanned the documents I'd pored over the night before. Ivy's treatments hadn't been cheap, that much I understood. But the extent to which Mom had tied everything to my accounts left my stomach hollow. Transactions, authorizations, transfers. Some of them shockingly recent. "Everything okay?" I looked up. Eugene was standing there, coffee in hand, his sweatshirt reading, "Support Local Radio." I nodded and motioned to the seat across from me. He sat without fuss, and we both listened to the cafe's quiet rhythm, the clink of spoons, the hum of conversation. After a while, I murmured, "They didn't just use me for the medical stuff. It was financial, too." Eugene nodded slowly. "You thinking of saying something?" "I'm not sure," I said, watching the world outside fog the glass. "It's not just the money. It's that I don't matter unless they need me. I'm not a person to them. I'm a function." He stirred his coffee, then said, "Sometimes, naming the hurt is the first step to healing it." I gave a half smile. "So what would you call this?" He didn't answer right away. "A reckoning. Theirs, not yours." They just don't see it yet. Later, back home, I found an email from Mom. Subject: Ivy update. No greeting, no warmth. Just a note saying Ivy had another scan coming up. And a final line: we'll need you to sign some updated documents. I closed my laptop. No response. No more playing along. As the sun dipped outside, my phone buzzed. Aunt Dottie's name lit the screen. Her message was short. Call me when you can. There's something you should know. My chest tightened. The last time she reached out was for Ivy's birthday, 3 years ago. I hadn't known about it until the day of. I slipped the phone into my pocket. This wasn't just about a holiday, or even Ivy's illness. It was deeper than that. And I was done pretending otherwise. Aunt Dottie's voice trembled more than I remembered. Clara, she said, skipping any greeting. I didn't want to be part of this, but I think it's time you knew. I was pacing the living room of my apartment, the rain tapping gently on the windows like a ticking clock. I hadn't spoken to Dottie since Dad's memorial. That day, she had tried to hand me an old family photo, and Mom had snatched it away before I could even touch it. What is it? I asked, gripping my phone like it might steady me. She paused. Ivy's power of attorney. It wasn't just about her care. Your mom needed someone to sign it, someone she could trust. At the time, she thought keeping close to you would make that easier. I sank onto the couch, my heart heavy. She used my bond with Ivy to get me to sign, didn't she? She knew you wouldn't refuse, Dottie replied gently. And after you did, she didn't have to pretend anymore. And there it was. The shift I'd felt in my gut, but never had the words for. The moment when Mom's coolness had settled in. Not sudden, but calculated. As if I'd gone from daughter to liability once my usefulness had run dry. She told me you were exaggerating, Dottie went on. But I've been watching. I saw you weren't at Thanksgiving. I saw your posts. I should have spoken up sooner. I thanked her, ended the call, and sat in silence. My hands shook, not from surprise, but from the cold sting of validation. It wasn't new. It was truth finally spoken. Later, I met Eugene at the park, where the last gold leaves still clung to the trees. He passed me half his bag of crumbs for the ducks, like always. We stood side by side, letting the quiet settle. Did you know, I whispered, that my mom's love had conditions? He flicked a crumb toward the pond. I had a feelin', he said. Control can wear the mask of love. I breathed out. She only needed me for a signature. After that, she didn't. But now, he said, glancing at me, you decide what you're needed for. That night, I wrote Ivy. Not to accuse, just to reach out. I told her I hoped she was okay, that I'd been thinking about Mom's sudden shift, about what might have happened behind the scenes. I asked if she'd ever wondered too. Her reply came with just 3 words. I've wondered too. I stared at Ivy's message for a long time. Those 3 words pulsing on the screen like a quiet echo. I've wondered too. It wasn't an admission, not exactly. But it cracked something open. A shared recognition that maybe neither of us had ever been in control of our roles in the family. I called her that evening. No texting, no emails, just a call. To my surprise, she answered on the first ring. Her voice was soft, hesitant. Hey. Hey, I replied, unsure where to begin. I wasn't expecting you to reply. Yeah, I almost didn't, she said. But I keep thinking about Thanksgiving and everything. We talked for nearly an hour. Ivy told me how Mom had made decisions on her behalf for years, sometimes hiding behind her illness to justify excluding me. Ivy hadn't asked for the power of attorney, she said. It was presented to her as already done, signed, final. She told me it was safer this way, Ivy said quietly, because you were too emotional, that you'd make things harder if things got worse. I sat down on the couch, stunned. I was emotional because I cared. I know, Ivy whispered. I know that now. That single sentence made my throat tighten. For so long, it had felt like shouting into the void, trying to be seen, heard, understood. And now, in a quiet living room, Ivy was saying the thing I needed to hear most. I don't know what to do next, she said. But I don't want to keep pretending. Then don't, I replied. We can start over, but it has to be honest this time. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, the silence not heavy, but full. Ivy and I weren't close, not yet, but something had shifted. A thread had been retied. The next morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. Real mail, handwritten envelope. It was from Aunt Dottie. Inside was a copy of a document I didn't recognize at first. Then I saw my own signature, shaky and young-looking, and the words, Irrevocable Trust Transfer Authorization. Below it, a yellow sticky note in Dottie's looping script. She said you'd never notice. Thought you should have a copy. My hands went cold. It wasn't just manipulation. It was theft. I sat at my kitchen table, the document spread out in front of me like a crime scene photo. My eyes kept returning to my signature. 18 years old, trusting, unaware. The date lined up perfectly with the summer Mom had taken me to the bank, just to set up a college account. I remembered the free lollipops and the way she'd smiled too much. The sticky note from Aunt Dottie still rested beside it. She said you'd never notice. And she'd been right. Until now. That afternoon, I walked to Eugene's place. He opened the door with his usual slow calm, eyes scanning my face before he stepped aside. Found something, I said, holding up the paper. We sat on his porch with glasses of sweet tea. I told him everything. Mom's forged path to power, Ivy's doubts, Dottie's quiet rebellion. He listened without interrupting, just nodding now and then, his gaze steady. You gonna go after them? He asked. I don't know yet, I said. But I'm done pretending it didn't happen. Eugene leaned back, his rocker creaking. Sometimes justice doesn't mean burning the house down. Sometimes it means reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to steal. Later that week, I met Ivy at a cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. She looked thinner than I remembered, pale under her scarf, but there was strength in her eyes I hadn't seen before. I talked to Dottie too, she said after we ordered. She told me about the trust. I nodded. I thought Mom cared about me. Maybe she did, but it was always attached to something. Ivy wrapped her fingers around her mug. I don't want to be her pawn anymore. Neither did I. We decided quietly to meet with an attorney, not to wage war, but to document what had been done, to make sure it didn't happen again. Ivy even offered to speak to Mom directly, not to accuse, but to reclaim the space between us. We walked out of the cafe just as a cold wind swept through. Ivy paused and looked up at the gray sky. I was Mom's favorite, she said softly, but only when it worked for her. I took a breath, then replied, Yeah, me too. And for the first time, I didn't feel bitter. I felt free. When love is conditional, it leaves a hunger that only real connection can satisfy. But even in the shadow of betrayal, a small act of understanding, like Ivy's courage to face the truth with me, can reopen doors we thought were long closed. Loyalty born from fear isn't love, and worth isn't measured by someone else's shifting affection. If this story stayed with you, maybe take a moment today to reach out, not for validation, but to remind someone they've always mattered just as they are. Sometimes the kindest thing we can offer is finally seeing someone clearly